I want to revive this YouTube channel and I'm not quite sure how yet. It's a work in progress. I think the video essay format really doesn't come naturally to me at all. I also don't really watch that many video essays these days. It's just not a format that I enjoy. I largely will read non-fiction books or I'll read articles. I love a lecture, but like a pre-recorded lecture's been posted online, but I'm not really a big fan of the video essay format. I do think the video essay format sort of lends itself to slightly reductive arguments that are based on storytelling, but that's not really largely my issue with it, because you could say the same thing about any means of communicating non-fiction information, whether that's an op-ed in a newspaper or a TikTok or an Instagram infographic or a non-fiction book that you buy at the fucking airport. You could say that about any medium, so it's not that. It's just not really how I learned. 2025 was the year of Lou figuring out like irrational technology, what the structure is, kind of all the different ways that I could go about doing it and what it means. And I've sort of got that to a really, really good place going into the new year. And I've got a bit of a structure. And that's not necessarily, I'll touch on that in this video, but what I want to talk about is largely my learning process, what I want to learn in 2026, and kind of how I'm going to apply that. So I will touch on how I'm taking irrational technology into the new year and what that looks like, but I'm only touching on it because I'm using it to explain how my learning process feeds into that. Now, these obviously aren't all the books that I'll read in 2026, they'll be ridiculous, but these are the non-fiction ones that I already have to hand. So first of all, there are a couple of like big questions that I've been gnawing on that I'm wanting to incorporate into my work in the new year, but not all of these books and not all of the things I have on my learning list are necessarily even remotely related to those things. Um, but some of them are. And I want to start with that because it might give a bit of context. So first of all, um, LLMs, I think, I just from a design perspective, I question why everything has to be a chatbot. Now, people saw this coming, that AI would advance to a point like this is not something that people didn't see coming. I have been warned about this for years prior to OpenAI taking off, that chatbots would be the next big thing. But it's not the only way to present the information that LLMs can produce. One of my first essays in the new year will be about alternative approaches to basically non-chatbot AI and systems approaches to this. So that's something I'm really interested in. It's largely from a paper called the AI Centrist Manifesto. He poses questions throughout it on how interface elements contribute to this misattribution of consciousness. And it got me thinking about how it's really obvious to me and to most designers that not every way of presenting an LLM has to be a chatbot, and that there's clearly social and mental health dangers to this. But naturally, as usual, big tech doesn't really give a monkeys, and they're not doing anything about it. This is the interface effect. And it's about how we interface with media. It's about an interface in a broad sense of the word, how that relates to how the interface presents itself on the computer. And it's really interesting. And I think for me, in questioning the chatbot interface, it's important to sort of understand what an interface is, what it means, and how we interface with the world. This is quite philosophically heavy, and there's a lot of diagrams. I love a diagram in theory, but I'm not a visual thinker, so I do struggle to actually understand diagrams. Um, but I'm really excited to read this and apply it to my work on non-chat AI, because it's about a question about questioning the assumptions of the interface and what they are, which leads into another sort of thing I've been thinking about recently, which is along the same vein, the future of the operating system, the personal operating system as it exists, which is largely impossible to change because it's based on so much physical infrastructure that would take astronomical amounts of money and labor power to do anything about. But I find it really interesting to imagine alternative operating systems and what they might look like. There's a couple projects I really like on this at the moment that I will be keeping an eye on throughout the new year, which largely focus on ambient computing, which you might think that sounds just like another way of saying, oh, like we all need to, computers should be everywhere and computers are great, blah, blah, blah. And it's this particularly came from this blog called Cyborgs versus Rooms, which is two visions for the futures of computing, but in this blog called Interconnected. Cyborgs basically means wearables, and rooms means ubiquitous computing. Those are two quite different things because one is the computing being on the body, and the other is the computing being in the room. And it discusses the definition of a cyborg historically, um, what that means and what that means for things like Apple AirPods, Meta AI, glasses, etc. So that's one vision for the future of computing, but it's not necessarily the only one. You've got augmented environments and room scale computing, things like basically the Star Trek holodeck in short. Uh, I swear he had something about, I can never fucking remember the name of it. I feel like it's one of those ones where if you're a UX designer, there's a really interesting work on his blog about like AI, UX, UI, all that kind of stuff. And I find it really, really interesting to keep up with. And he's one of the people I'm going to be keeping up with. So that's Matt Webb and his blog, the Interconnected blog. And I think in terms of understanding what the future of computing might look like and the future of the OS more broadly, and questioning the OS as a medium of interacting with computing, um, and what that can tell us about how we interact with technology and how it might be built for community better. That's one of the blogs that I would absolutely be keeping up with. I'm hoping to be able to incorporate some of his ideas into actual projects in 2026. More on that later, perhaps. This book. I've also been thinking a lot about the way that the internet and social media specifically creates like knowledge as commodity. So it's kind of like we can't you've probably seen these arguments before online. We can't gain actual capital as Gen Z. We can't really gain a lot of actual capital most of the time. So knowledge has become a form of capital and it's became a commodity because it also plays into how social media is designed and persuasive design because you can get this emotional reward from feeling like you've learned something, even if you've not learned something. I've spoken about this quite a lot before in a lot of previous essays, but what I'm interested in 2026 is the broader idea of knowledge as commodity and how that impacts content creation and the internet more broadly in a sort of like systems sense of what this means for society and what are the opportunities for people who genuinely want to teach others, or how do we create that sort of cultural shift away from knowledge as commodity. So for that, obviously, I'm reading Psychopolitics by a German person whose name I'm not going to try and pronounce, who I believe has Korean heritage, hence the name I can't pronounce, although I couldn't pronounce the German name either. Um, so that's one of the ones I'm reading for that because yeah, everybody says it's really good. I'd kind of avoided reading him because it's kind of one of those like everybody says to read it, so I feel like it can't be good. And I don't say that to be a pick me. It's just like in my experience, it's usually quite reductive. But so far, I think actually what makes him as well known as he is his absolutely extraordinary ability to explain his ideas, which is also something I'm working on next year. Again, more on that later. And while I bought that from Verso in their end of year sale, and I also got this, and it's called the Imperial Archive: Knowledge and the Fantasy of Empire. So I've spoken a lot before about digital exceptionalism and how it limits our ability to understand the digital. So digital exceptionalism is the idea that digital technology is somehow really, really unique and different from anything that's came in the past. So you can't use any sort of past paradigms to understand it, and we need totally new paradigms. And it's basically just nonsense. It's nonsense. It's nonsense. I'm not going to expand on that. It is nonsense. I'm talking about that in relation to the book that is there. I'm not getting off this chair. Burning Images, and how effigy protests tell us a lot. The history of effigy protests throughout ancient history tell us a lot about cancel culture and how social media has basically twisted the effigy impulse into a desire to cancel people. I might write a Substack on that at some point, but it feels a bit cliche. I don't think it's anything people have actually pointed out before, but my problem about talking about cancel culture like that is that as a leftist, it's really easy for like anytime you make any critique of cancel culture, the right take it and basically just go, haha, see, this lefty thinks cancel culture is bad, which isn't what I'm saying. I'm not making a moral judgment on cancel culture when I talk about it in this context. I'm just saying, like, this is why we do this. That's like as an amoral, just a, I'm pointing it out. But anyway, so I want to explore this book for those exact same reasons, because I think learning about how, so the British Empire was largely based on the way it was managed and the way it was maintained was through information and knowledge, both within like bureaucratic systems in Britain and externally in terms of how that information was collected, and also in terms of propaganda and the education system that still goes on in a lot of schools across the UK, particularly in England and Wales to this day. So I'm interested in this because also in terms of imperial history, it's really important to learn about um your own heritage and your own history. So obviously I'm Scottish, if you hadn't already picked up on that. And people often say it's a very, especially my Irish relatives, a very common refrain is, how the fuck did England manage to conquer that much of the world? There's like, they're really not very bright. Um, the answer to that, unfortunately, is Scotland. Because see, when people will talk a lot about how Scotland's like very really long list of inventions, what it doesn't talk about is that most of those inventions were invented at the height of the British Empire. So they were the invention of those inventions, Jesus fuck man, were very entwined with what's spoken about in this book. So it's also about a personal reflection on how I relate to myself as someone who wants to create things within that cultural history. But again, I'm using that to understand knowledge influencing and knowledge as commodity on social media and what that's going to mean. And this video is not meant to be like me telling you things that I have the answers to. I could be totally wrong about all of that. And I might read those books and I might realize that I'm wrong. I might read those books and realize that they're wrong and I have a totally different idea about what it should look like. This video is about me telling you about things I want to learn. Okay. Um, Another topic I've been interested in is how there's this sort of false distinction between creating the software on the internet and creating content on the internet. So, from a design perspective, when you bring it back to first principles, both of those things equally go into the end users and the end community's experience of the digital. They're not two totally separate spheres. They're very interconnected with one another, but the way we think of them as professionals, as content creators, as designers, as software engineers, as data scientists, as whatever the fuck we are, is often about thinking about them as very, very separate things, but they're not separate, which is why I've been learning a lot. I mean, I do already do work in like communications, and this is something I've kind of already been chewing on for I think a few years now, because I do a lot of like marketing and comms work to pay my bills. And I've always said like I appreciate taking a UX perspective to that work because it's the same thing, right? Because you're examining how someone experiences the internet and then you're redesigning it to be more aligned with the goals of the company or organization you're doing work for. That's, I take a UX approach to the marketing, digital communications as well. So that's been brewing for quite a few years, but I have been sort of exploring that in a broader sense recently and thinking about how that might relate to irrational technology, what I want to do with it, and how understanding that, how developing my own understanding of that and contributing to others' understanding of that, and using that understanding in projects that I'm working on could contribute to a more democratic internet where people actually understand what's going on. So I learn about communications and things. So there's a couple of things I've got here to teach me about that. This one is the logic of connective action, which is about the difference between, no, I read the introduction to this and I can't remember. I think it's connective and collective action, which are two different things, I gather. Yes. So it's about the difference between something called connective action and collective action, how that manifests on social media, how digital media personalization sort of changes this and what that means for politics and activism. I couldn't explain to you much more about it than that. This is Superstorm, Design and Politics in the Age of Information. I'm really excited to read this. I've actually had it on my shelf for a few years and it's just not really been super relevant to anything I've yet worked on. So I've not read it yet, but obviously it's relevant to this thing I've been thinking about a lot. It's the Superstorm. The title of the book is meant to be like a metaphor to illustrate the way that information exists on the internet today and how like design contributes to that superstorm and all of that stuff. So, side note, if you're wondering why I'm not looking at the camera during this video, it's because I really struggle to articulate myself on camera because I had like a camera dad in the early 2000s. If you know what I mean by this, I'm sorry. Um, it's like so there's like I got millions of photos taken of me as a child and it just gave me a total fear of cameras, largely just because I was quite oppositional as a child. So I would just argue with people about everything all the time. To be fair, that's not changed. I still do that as an adult. So I've realized one of the things I realized while I was developing irrational technology is that that's a really big barrier to the success of the project. So I'm trying to just look off in this direction rather than look at the camera because I don't see myself at the camera. Because see, when I'm talking to myself, like I have such good ideas, and then I whip out my camera and I really struggle to articulate it. So I'm looking off into the middle distance as a way of like dealing with that. I don't know how I'm going to translate that to TikTok, but keep yourself posted to find out, I guess. These books are more personal. Like I said earlier, I have a bit of childhood trauma. First of all, the camera thing, and second of all, the accent thing. So if you're Scottish, you probably have picked up on the fact that I have a quite posh accent. If you're English and you don't hate Scottish people, you've probably picked up on the fact that I have a quite posh accent. If you're English and you hate Scottish people, you probably are surprised by the fact that other people think I have a posh accent. And to that, I would say, go and deconstruct that before you continue watching any of my videos because there's too much of that in my comment section recently. Um, so I have a whole thing complex about the different accents that I have heard and developed over the years, and people like to put very, very, very simplistic um views of who I am from that perspective onto me, and have done for a good many years. Before I went to school, I didn't really have as posh an accent, and I spoke a lot more with Scots interspersed in English, and a lot more like basically sounded a lot more Glaswegian. And that quickly, rapidly changed when I went to school for a lot of very personal reasons that I don't want to divulge on the internet. Um, but um, the way I speak to myself in my head never changed. The way I speak to myself in my head, well, it got more complex, but accent wise, it stayed the same as it was when I was 4 years old before I went to school, which is much more Glaswegian than what comes out my mouth, which I struggle with because then it makes it really difficult to articulate my ideas. And I've thought about this a lot. I'm for my whole adult life about the nature of articulating myself and what that means and what it looks like for me. And a lot of the time when I've raised this with friends or ex-lovers, I get a lecture about how, well, articulation is like, like telling people they need to articulate themselves better is actually just like classist, blah, 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 blah. Um, anyway, as if I don't know that. Cool. I figured that one out at 4 years old. I'm glad you came to that realization in your 20s. Anyway, we're not here to rehash my personal drama. So for a long time I avoided it because I thought it wasn't like the right thing to do and that I just needed to like power through and sort of girl boss my way into sounding authentic. But first of all, being authentic is made up. Second of all, when I say articulation, I don't mean speaking properly and speaking in a way that is seen as more acceptable to others. I mean being able to get my thoughts from here to here in a way that feels like I'm reflecting how I'm thinking more, which I struggle with because the way I think in my head and what comes out of my mouth are two totally different people. The way I sound in my head is a lot more like God's Teeth by James Kelman, which is my favorite book ever. James Kelman is actually one of my favorite authors because the way he writes in a lot of Scots, but the way he writes in it is very intelligent. A lot of the times when you see Scots represented on like in media, it's not like scholarly, and I don't mean that in a bad way. It's like talking with your pals down the pub, still game type stuff, and that's not bad. It's just it's not how I think because I'm a reader and I'm an overthinker, right? So that's not how I think. But James Kelman doesn't write like that. He writes um the way that I speak to myself. He writes the way I speak to myself. And God's Teeth is about this author who gets invited to do like these workshops down south in England, and it's basically just his inner monologue. And if you've ever worked with me like at all, and you're not Scottish, I can promise you this is what was going through my head most of the time. If you're watching this, I'm sorry. It's not a criticism, it's just working across different cultures is sometimes complex. He's stuck in a rented car, for some context. Call yourself a gear stick. You're no gear stick. I've seen better fucking gear sticks on fuck knows what. A kid's fucking wind up fucking racing car. You're a matchstick, you cunt. You'd be better lighting the fire. Beep, beep. I'll fucking beep, beep. You'd break into and pitch you the fucking window, you cunt. That's what I'll do. You and your fucking beep, beep. Such are the inner dialogues I have to contend with. One thinks of Poe or Lermontov or Stevenson, von Kleist, old Hawthorne. Anyway, you get the picture. That's my inner monologue. It shifts between stale game and pretentious performative reader book person. And then what comes out of my mouth is somehow neither of those things and also worse. So as a result of that, I bought these two books. This one is by Carol Fleming. It's the way you say it. I've read the introduction and it's a little bit personal experiency, which I tend to distaste, which I tend to not enjoy. She tends to assume she's talking a lot about like the emotional roots of it and how it comes from shame for a lot of people. I definitely used to have shame. I don't really have shame around Scots anymore. I haven't in a long time, but I'm hoping this will help me, figure out more of that and help to translate it from here to here. And this one is more like practical guides, I think. It's called The Art of Explanation and it came quite highly recommended. So it's about the actual structure of how you explain things and actually structuring them and explaining them well. So I'm looking forward to reading both of those and I'm hoping that'll really enhance this project. I kind of plan to read them as I go along. So you probably read them like pretty sparsely, maybe like a chapter a week or something, and then try and implement it into whatever project I'm doing, whether it's about the knowledge stuff, the OS stuff, the AI stuff, the other fucking thing I mentioned that has escaped my memory. Um, I'm hoping I will sort of be able to implement the ideas kind of slowly and surely and improve over the year. Um, and I'm hoping that will sort of structure what I'm doing better. More broadly, structure I settled on for my content is that what I want to do, I struggle a lot with like posting regularly, posting on theme, blah, 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 blah. It's not something I'd figured out, which is why rational technology isn't in the place it could be, even though I am happy with where it's been. So throughout 2025, exploring A, B, C, D, E, F, G, I've kind of settled on a structure, which is I'll have three broad themes each month that I'm exploring. Roughly one of these will be sort of UX analysis of communications or politics, looking at a certain event online from a UX design perspective. And then another theme will be looking at emerging research and talking about how that might impact people and communities, like um, like the AI one that I was talking about, exploring non-chat bot interfaces for large language models. That's going to be the first one along those themes. And another one might be more politically, philosophically focused, or it might be more sort of focused on a future vision. So the academic exploring things from academic papers and taking that and explaining what that might look like and the future visioning are technically two separate categories, but quite often they might intersperse with one another, but they also might be separate. But broadly, what I'm doing is I'm going to choose three main themes each month and then like understand them, decide what I think about them, where that's got from. And then from that, I'll hopefully do a podcast, a blog post, and some TikToks. But I don't start it in a certain format. It just starts with a whole bunch of notes on what I think about, say, knowledge as commodity, which is one of the ones I might be exploring. For example, one of the first ones in January, like I said, is going to be the AI. I'm also thinking a lot about psychopolitics and influencers and knowledge commodity in relation to sort of like the shift towards the private internet, which is a thing. If you didn't know, like I think it's something like over 40% of interactions online happen in private group chats, forums, etc. Sorry, I thought I saw a spider. Um, and that's a lot compared to previous years. It's really steadily increasing. It's got kind of everybody in a flap in like marketing circles and stuff like that. Everybody's in a bit of a flap about it. But I've noticed that there's quite a significant rise in influencers basically creating their own micro platforms, if you want to call them that, through a service like Substack or Patreon or even a Discord community that you pay to enter. That's something that's really been increasing in popularity. And I want to explore that as a phenomenon and explore it sort of like how we perceive influencing as a job, how that relates to the reality of influencing, how those two things can be quite different, the nature of corporate control over the industry, and whether this creation of micro platforms, as I'm calling them, but I've not verified or validated that term yet. So if I've totally got the linguistics of that wrong, please let me know in the comments, but I will do my own research into that before I publish this. If that does that actually solve those problems of corporate control, or does it replicate patterns that are damaging to people and communities? What are alternative ways of learning online? Using that as an analysis to explore alternative forms of learning online. But that's sort of that's how that project theme fits into the broader things that I'm exploring right now. But the essay will focus specifically on the rise of micro platforms. Probably from a pretty personal perspective in terms of like, you're a person consuming content on the internet, you've seen this, you do this. Is this helpful for you? Is it not? How does that relate to politics? Um, and Psychopolitics has some really interesting ideas about the neoliberal self and the economy of affect and how that might relate to it. So I'm going to be incorporating that into it. Again, yeah, this was a bit of a rambly one. I don't. Anyway, I've also moved this chair. So I had a whole crisis when I was staying at my parents over Christmas because I was like, I feel so relaxed here and I do not feel relaxed in my own flat. And that's because basically, if I don't want to study at my work, if I don't want to work at my desk, I have to work on the couch because I don't have another chair in here. But I had this chair in my bedroom and it was just sitting there. And I basically just threw clothes on it. I didn't do anything with it. So, and I had got rid of the remnants of an IKEA kitchen that I'd only just got rid of like just before Christmas. It's a sore fucking subject. Never get a kitchen from IKEA, by the way. So I had more space in the office, and I was thinking, what am I putting in this? For context, I'm aware I'm talking about having an office in my flat, and that might sound a bit pretentious. My kitchen's like this size. I opted to get a tiny kitchen and a spare room to work in and throw shit in. Um, I question whether that was the right decision on a daily basis, but I'm happy about it right now. When I'm trying to cook for people, I start to question that decision. Anyway, I've been rearranging to sort of work a bit better. And I'm enjoying this little chair. And I think this little chair could be a good if I feel good about this video, not necessarily if it like I think if a couple people see it and like leave a comment about it being helpful or interesting, that would be nice. But largely this is just an exploration. I think I want the YouTube thing to be more sort of like casual, I guess. And I'm not about to become a vlogger, but I guess I'll just talk about like what I'm learning, what I'm reading, things I'm thinking about in a sort of unstructured way. Well, it's semi-structured, but not like I don't want to do video essays, like I said. I don't like them. They stress me out. I feel like there's a lot of pressure around the video essay that just makes me fundamentally uncomfortable because the vast majority of the pressure is not about the scholarly quality of the work. It's about like, is your outfit cool? Do you have an expensive camera? And like I said, that exists in every medium, but for me personally, something about the way that exists on video essays makes me sad. And partly that is because I hate talking to a camera, which again, I'm gonna work on that. Um, but also, I just think I've been watching a lot of content. The kind of content I watch on YouTube these days is more this kind of stuff. So if that's what I'm watching on YouTube and then I'm consuming more structured analysis on other platforms and other mediums, then maybe that's what my work should reflect. I'm definitely not going to create video essays. That's not happening again. I might do this in like a podcast format where I just like read out the essays, but um, I also might just keep it like this kind of stuff. I don't know what that would look like if I'm not telling you like my reading list, but I suppose we'll find out.